Hello and welcome to another episode of The State of Politics. Today we are delighted to be joined by Scottish Labour MSP, Sarah BOYACK. Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. We know you're really busy just now with the election coming up, so thanks again for joining us today. I'm joined by my usual co-host Patrick McGilp, and we're going to be chatting all things Scottish Labour, talking through the manifesto and some other key issues. So first of all, to kick us off, Sarah, could you give us a bit about yourself, your role as an MSP, what you and role as an MSP, and how you get into politics?
Okie doke. Well, in the Parliament that's just coming to an end, I was actually came back into Parliament in 2019, and I was on the Local Government and Communities Committee, and I was Scottish Labour's Local Government and Planning spokesperson. But I actually first got elected to the Parliament in 1999, and I had campaigned for a Scottish Parliament for most of my adult life. And my dad was very involved in the cross-party campaign for Scottish Parliament, that campaigned for the referendum that we had after Labour was elected in 1997. And part of the campaigning I got involved in was to make sure that we had more women involved in the Parliament. And also I had got involved through my former work as a town planner. I was very interested in transport. I was interested in our communities. And I think I was very interested in politics from quite an early age, because my dad, who was a councillor for a brief time, took me on a visit one day to visit constituents. We went to these tenement flats in Leith, and in those days the toilets were actually outside. And I remember being really shocked at the living conditions people had. So for me, it kind of linked together how we lived, our houses, town planning, and then politics. So come 99, when I got elected to the Parliament, Donald Dewar appointed me to his coalition negotiation team on day one. I went into the office thinking that something must have gone wrong during the election. And why was the new First Minister calling me in? And he said, no, he wanted to appoint me to his negotiation team. And that gave me a really good insight from day one. And the first term of the Scottish Parliament, in the first year, I was appointed as our Planning and Transport and Environment Minister. And that was just an amazing experience, because having been interested in those issues, I'd been on the National Transport Forum that the Labour government had set up in 97. I'd been convener of the Planning Institute in Scotland, and I had chaired our Labour Environment campaign for the previous 10 years. So it was really fantastic. New MSP. I'd not been a representative of constituents before, but I got to do things like really radical things, like our first national parks in Scotland, very big railways investment, because I thought that was absolutely critical. So new railway lines, and got the process going for the Borders Railway. But things like Airdrie to Bathgate, Stirling to Alloa, really important that those new railways were introduced. And also our first cycling investment. So it was an incredibly exciting time to get elected to that brand new Parliament, and to be able to start making a difference from day one. And I honestly had not expected that when I got elected, but what it did show me was what you can do if you're both an MSP and if you're a minister. You can really, really transform people's lives.
You say you're interested in politics from an early age, and I think you said your dad was a councillor as well. Have you always been a member of the Labour Party, and has that ever sort of wavered in your mind? Has it always been Scottish Labour?
Yeah, I think from pretty early on. I think I must have joined when I was about 16, I think. And I was interested in debating at school. And I was really annoyed because I missed the 1979 elections. So when I went to university, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And I have to say that got an awful lot of us involved in politics, because we were really unhappy what happened in our universities. I went to Glasgow University, and you could see the impacts of the Conservative cuts pretty early on. So yeah, and I think the exciting thing about going to university was I met lots of other people with similar ideas, and we had lots of debates. And that was really good. And we weren't just working as a Labour club, we were working with other different groups as well, involved in local community activities. So for me, it was probably quite early on in life, but I've not just lived in, although I was brought up in Edinburgh, I've lived in Glasgow, I've lived in London, and I've lived in Stirling. So I've seen local politics in different areas, but I've always been a very strong Labour supporter and very strong activist as well. And my interest in environment goes back to the very early days. So I'm now our climate spokesperson, and environment and land reform. And to me, that's really exciting because there's so much that I think the Parliament can do on those issues. And that's one thing, that elections are coming up very soon. And I'm hopeful that the issues I've been campaigning on, we're going to be able to actually take right into the centre stage in the Parliament again.
I think that's something we'll come on to later, because I've been speaking to some of our other guests about that, and I think it's really refreshing that in this election, especially, that everybody is talking about climate, because time is running out and we need to do stuff fast. So just to go back to what you said, Sarah, you said you were part of that early negotiation team with the Liberal Democrats in the early years of the Parliament. Could you give us a bit of background to that? Because I think you're the first person I've had on that's ever kind of been involved in a coalition negotiation. Could you give us a brief background to how that comes about and what kind of discussions you do and how you get to the point of becoming a coalition?
Well, I think we didn't have enough for a majority, and partly that was because when we campaigned for the Scottish Parliament, one of the things Scottish Labour was very keen on was that it was elected by proportional representation, so it represented people. And the system used was the one that was adopted in Germany after the war. And what that meant was we still had first past the post seats. So that meant that you could vote for your local rep, but it also meant that we had list seats, and that balanced up. So in the early days, Scottish Labour got a large number of constituency seats. But for example, there were areas like the Borders, where we got top-ups on the list, or the Highlands. And for the other parties as well, it meant that even if they hadn't won constituency seats, but they still had a decent size of support in Scotland, they got elected. And when we got elected in the very first Parliament in '99, Donald Dewar was very keen that we were able to have certainty, so that we were able to have key legislation that we wanted to get passed, and that we'd be able to do that. So we took a vote early on in our Labour group, and I think the Lib Dems did the same thing, and we agreed that we'd work together. So we spent about the first week negotiating on the different bits of our manifestos. So for me, it was things like childcare was going to be free, national parks. I was very keen on the new railways expansion. So it was very interesting seeing how that actually worked. And the people involved were Donald Dewar, who was the then First Minister, Sam Galbraith, who was the first Minister for Health, Henry McLeish, who was the next First Minister after Donald Dewar, and myself. And there was somebody else from the Labour team who'd been appointed as Donald Dewar's advisor, and we negotiated with Jim Wallace and his team. So I suppose what it did was it forced us to say what our real top priorities were. And I think from both sides, we basically got what we all wanted. And from that point of view, Donald Dewar then the next week appointed his cabinet. And that had it was mostly Labour, but it had two Lib Dem ministers. It had Jim Wallace, who became the Deputy First Minister, and the Agriculture Minister, Ross Finney, was the other Lib Dem, but the rest of us were all Labour, and included myself and Wendy Alexander and Susan Deacon. And what was exciting was we were all under 40. Now, that might not seem that exciting to you, but I have to say in politics, that was pretty much groundbreaking. And the other thing that was incredibly exciting that I'd campaigned on for years was to get a parliament that had women involved in it. Because I remember growing up where we didn't have lots of women councillors or MPs, and that was something I was passionate about changing. And you could see the difference it made in terms of support for childcare, action on domestic violence in the very first term of the Parliament, and trying to have an approach. So, for example, I introduced free bus passes for the over 60s, And somebody said to me, well, surely that's a social policy. That's nothing to do with transport. And I went, it is a transport policy, because if we encourage older people to use buses, there might be some people who are still going to work, sure, but they're paying their taxes. And if they're using a bus to get to work, that's getting a car off the street. So trying to join up policies, so you weren't just thinking about transport in a box, older people in a box, or women in a box. You're trying to join up so that you would have policies that would they'd be implemented, and they would have a really big impact on people's life chances and give them more opportunities. So that was the kind of thing that motivated me in the early days.
Speaking about your time as a minister in the first Scottish Government, what is it like trying to get your policies and your ideas into a piece of legislation, and then working with the civil service and sort of clerks in the Parliament, and then in cabinet meetings trying to get your bill before the Parliament for consideration? How in-depth a process, and how long can that take?
Well, I think one of the good things about the Scottish Parliament is that we spend quite a lot of time where, after ministers have introduced bills, and in my day what we did was we did our consultation, and then we put proposals into the Parliament, and there was a couple of bits of legislation we'd already worked on. There was transport legislation and national parks, and I think national parks was the first legislation that I'd actually been involved in. That was a town planner when I used to work several years before that in Stirling in Central Region. So it was quite exciting for something that I'd been involved in as a young professional planner to be involved in actually bringing that into the Parliament. And we were going to set up 2 national parks. So there was agreement from the Liberal Democrats, and they were strongly in favour of this. And there was support in the Parliament. But one of the things that was interesting about it was because although we had a coalition, one of the Liberal Democrat members wanted different details in the proposal, and what that meant was I had to then go and negotiate, because if I hadn't negotiated, I might not have got the bill through, because this person might have rebelled against the agreement they'd come to. So even when you have a majority in Parliament, it doesn't guarantee that you get your legislation through exactly as you plan, and you have to negotiate. And I think the consultation the Parliament has is excellent. So you've got the government does its consultation, then it comes to the Parliament. The committee will take evidence, and sometimes different committees are involved. And then after the committees have taken evidence, the bill goes back into the Parliament, and you have a vote in principle. Is this bill going to be supported or not? And once that is decided, if the decision is to support that, then the bill goes to the committees. And that's when individual members of Parliament get to propose changes to legislation. So, for example, in the last Parliament, we were having a debate on non-domestic rates, and I moved an amendment so that if a local authority was proposing community heat networks, or if it was a cooperative project, then it wouldn't have to pay for non-domestic rates, just so that it would make it more economically viable. And I was able to persuade the then minister that this was a good proposal. We brought in the evidence. The Parliament clerks helped me draft my amendment, and that got agreed. And when the bill came back to the Parliament after it was recommended for approval, it got voted on by all of us. So that's probably 2 bills I've been involved in. One when I was minister and I had to negotiate, and another when I was lobbying for change just in the last Parliament, and I got change. So I think that's a good thing about the Parliament, that there's accountability, and it means that if a group outside the Parliament have got really strong views on something, so for example, Monica Lennon's bill on period poverty, that was initially opposed by the SNP government, but Monica had done so much work with young women's organisations. She'd gone out and consulted with anti-poverty groups, and by the time her bill came to the Parliament, we were able to get it through, and I was on that committee as well. And that was fascinating because the government were against, and then when we got to our amendments, and just before we did the stage 1 debate, the government had changed its mind, so we were able to get amendments through. So I think that's one of the strengths of our Parliament.
I think everybody would agree that bill was great, and but the girls involved in that, along with Monica, well done to them all, because I think it's something that helps a lot of people, and I think it's a brilliant piece of legislation that was introduced by Monica Lennon and that. So just to touch on there, Sarah, you were talking about committees and the process of the Scottish Parliament. Something that we've asked our previous guests is, do you think Holyrood needs more MSPs? Because currently we still see a lot of parties that are a bit stretched in terms of committees, in terms of representation. Would you like to see Holyrood eventually get to the stage where we have more MSPs in our Parliament?
I think that's quite a challenging issue, because I think a lot of the public don't really like having to pay a lot of money to have politicians. So you really have to have the evidence that it would make the difference. One of the things I would be quite keen on at the moment is probably more than the Parliament, but actually our local authorities. I can see that the salaries that MSPs get paid is way higher than councillors. And I think most councillors these days are full-time. So I suppose if it was up to me to prioritise, I'd start off with supporting our councils to have a bit more resource, a bit more cash, the capacity to do more as we come out the pandemic. And maybe it's time to have a look at the Parliament, but we've now got social security powers that we didn't have in the early days, and different powers on tax. So I was out the Parliament for 3 years because I lost my seat in 2016. And it was very interesting looking at the Parliament from outside and then coming back into it again, having been out for 3 years. And you could see that there are now people on 2 or 3 committees, and that's quite a workload for them. And in the last few months of the Parliament, the Parliament's corporate body decided to allow us to have a little bit of extra staff support. And I have to say that I found that made a huge difference, because the number of people writing in during the pandemic basically doubled, and people were writing in needing help. So people needed money for self-isolation, local businesses wanted support, people didn't know about how to get support in terms of not being evicted. There was just a huge number of people started writing in. So I definitely think there's something about enabling MSPs to represent their constituents effectively, because you've got your party job, and for me it's Scottish Labour and being enthusiastic about getting our ideas implemented. You've got your committee posts, and then you've got your constituency representation. And in the early days I was a local member for Edinburgh Central, and in the last Parliament and the one before that I was a regional list member. And that means you're covering a bit of East Lothian, a bit of Mid Lothian, Musselburgh, thinking of Musselburgh, Mid Lothian, West Lothian and Edinburgh. And that is a huge area to cover. And if you're thinking about young people, students, older people, businesses, campaigners on housing, that is a lot of people to represent. So I think it would be worth, as part of our recovery from the pandemic, looking at how we can make the Parliament more accountable. The other thing we've missed is, because everybody's doing everything online on Zoom, Parliament members have not been out and about in the way we might have been before. So visiting island communities has been off the agenda, or anywhere outside, but that has probably impacted on people who are not digitally connected. So that's one of the things I'd like to have a look at in the next Parliament, is how you can make sure that people can still get in touch with us properly and give evidence.
You were speaking earlier about councillors possibly receiving a sort of wage rise because they're all full-time and they're not paid anywhere near as much as MSPs are paid. Keir Starmer's spoken about a sort of building a federal Britain, or a sort of Devo Max for Scotland. That would obviously bring powers to the Scottish Parliament. Neil Findlay was on, I think, 2 weeks ago, and he was saying how the Scottish Government are sort of centralising and taking powers away from local authorities. What powers would you like to see move from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament, and then from the Scottish Parliament to local authorities?
Well, I think that the priority for me at the moment would probably be devolving power to our councils. I think in terms of the UK, I'm very struck by, you've now got 4 different governments in the UK, and there's different things happening. You've got different political leadership. In Northern Ireland, you've got very different kind of leadership, and they're going through a very challenging time at the moment in terms of the border in Ireland and the impact of Brexit. But you've got 2 parties that are totally different, but they're having to try and work together. In Wales, it's a Labour government, and at the UK level, you've got the Tories. And one of the things that struck me over the last 20 years is there's not enough sharing of best practice. And you might find that odd for me to say that, but there are things we could learn from Wales, definitely. And there are also things that we have done in Scotland over the years that I think others could learn from. In the early days of the Parliament, as a minister, I learned a lot from visits to Denmark, where I learned what they were doing on things like recycling. They were streets ahead of us, and they still are on renewables, way ahead of us in terms of community renewables that would heat your home affordably. So I think there's something about learning from other people. And although I said a minute ago, constituents find it harder to get in touch with us, I have found it easier to network with people in different parts of the UK. And that's not something I expected in the pandemic. So having discussions with women members of the Welsh Assembly and also with the UK Parliament, Labour members, and talking about how we want to change things for our constituents. So I think for me, I would prioritise financial support for local authorities first, and also let them take decisions. So things like short-term lets in Edinburgh, that should be something the council's got more capacity to tackle. More powers on planning, I think, as well, and community powers on planning. And in terms of the UK, I'm very keen to get back to Parliament because I would like to be involved in the suggestion of having a UK-wide constitutional convention to look at how we do things better. I mean, the House of Lords feels to me increasingly old-fashioned. If you look at it, it's very male-dominated. It's dominated by people who've inherited their peerage. And I think we should be moving a different system. And if we did different House of Lords, then that would be a second chamber to keep the UK government more accountable, but it potentially also open up opportunities for the rest of the UK to be involved in a dialogue. And you've got the Tories at the moment and you've got Boris, so that doesn't help. But even if it was a Labour government, I would want us to have more and better relations between the different parts of the UK. And I don't know if you remember the day when Andy Burnham got outside and challenged Boris on the pandemic, and I thought, this is a game changer. And I noticed within about a month, the SNP government started trying to look like they were consulting our local councils more. And you could see that they didn't want that same backlash in Scotland, because in terms of local government funding, the SNP don't pass enough money on to our councils. And when you would challenge the SNP about money coming from the UK government, the consequentials to help tackle the pandemic, what their response was to write to the councils and say, can you tell us exactly how you're going to spend this money? Now, that money should have just gone straight to them. Let them decide how to spend the extra money for business. Because in Edinburgh, you're talking about hospitality industry, you're talking about lots of small businesses. If it's the Western Isles, it's going to be tourism-related industry. So there are different circumstances across the country, and I would want to empower local government to have a much more respectful relationship with the Scottish government, but for the UK government to have a more respectful relationship with the Scottish government. So I think it's time for change there, but I think we can do that with the setup we've got. We can do that, and that's why I'm very keen to see a UK Constitution Convention that would empower people right across the UK. And if you think about the north of England and the northwest of England, there's long overdue opportunities to see how the mayors have worked, and be interested to look at the lessons from that.
I think that's a really refreshing perspective to take, because I think the pandemic has shown that, especially in local areas, that the people running those local areas do know them best, and they know where help needs to go, rather than just, the main government of the country deciding where money goes. So I think that's a really refreshing perspective to take, Sarah. You mentioned the House of Lords earlier on. Of course, some of your former Labour colleagues are down there, including Jack McConnell, of course, is one of the Lords. And something we've looked at in university is that the Lords, as you say, it's male dominated, even by class. A good percentage of people that are in the House of Lords have been privately educated. Do you think the House of Lords is an effective tool? And do you think that it is something that, once it would be reformed, it could be a lot better? Or would you like the Commons to be a bit more like Holyrood in terms of, obviously, of course, they've got committees that sit in the Commons, but do you think the House of Lords could be an effective tool if reformed properly?
Yeah, well, I think there are some fantastic people who are in the House of Lords, and folk like Jack McConnell. I mean, one of Jack's passions is international development and tackling poverty and using UK resources and our taxes to have a much more respectful relationship, for example, with our former colonies. So I think there are very good people in the House of Lords. I just think the power balance isn't there, and I think there are far too many people appointed by the Tories in particular. All parties get to appoint people to the House of Lords, but if basically the balance is people who've inherited that position, I think that's wrong. And that it's not I'm against all the people in there. It's just I think the system's wrong. And the other thing that would be, I mean, my top priority is recovery from the pandemic. But I go back to the point I made about learning from best practice. I think that's something we need to do more of. And having a second chamber keeps the House of Commons on its toes, because you don't have proportional representation there. So if you've got a government like we have at the moment with a big majority, then potentially having to be accountable to another chamber at least tests legislation. I mean, when the Parliament was set up, there was a lot of time spent looking at parliaments across the world. And that's why we spend so much time before the legislation gets into the chamber. You've already had lots of key interest groups have given evidence. So on the bill we talked about, Monica Lennon's bill, there was lots of young people involved in that consultation. Now that doesn't usually happen. When we had Daniel Johnson's bill, he's MP for Southern in Edinburgh, it was on shop workers, and it was about protecting shop workers and calling out threats on shop workers. And that involved ordinary shop workers, the trade union representing them, USDA, involved in coming to the Parliament and telling us what real life was like in shops. And I have to say, it's made me very conscious during the pandemic that, people that are working in supermarkets or corner shops or groceries, they have really gone the extra mile. I mean, we rightly talk about our NHS staff, but if you think all the shops that have been kept going, and people can feel grumpy during the pandemic, but watching the impact of that bill has made me very conscious of the fact that there's a lot of people quite vulnerable during the pandemic who are doing their day job. So, going back to that point, I think an elected House of Lords would be a better way to go. But again, I would pick that up in a discussion about, in Scotland, I would like local authorities and the Scottish Parliament to have a better dialogue. So on Monica's bill, the head of COSLA, the local authorities, came and talked to us, and some of them had started working on making sure that period products were available in schools, but it wasn't a requirement, and they weren't getting funding from the Scottish Government. So there's, on those kind of issues, I think it's not about thinking about local authorities, Scottish Parliament, UK Parliament. It's thinking about different levels of government. And then below the councils, community councils. There's loads more we could be doing to make our communities more engaged. And that's why land reform's on my list of things I want to act on post-election, because I think there's more we could do in Scotland in terms of land ownership to involve communities.
You're talking there about workers, Sarah. One thing we've seen over the last month or two is the GMB strike over, I think it's British Gas fire and rehire. I think the Scottish Government's been talking about a publicly owned energy company. Obviously, with a publicly owned company, you'd see, well, the government could control sort of workers' rights and workers' wages and all that. Would that be something that the Scottish Labour Party would support, so that these unfair practices can't happen?
Yeah, well, we've absolutely got to call them out, because it's called fire and rehire. So these are people who could have worked for British Gas for years, trained engineers, trained people that would come to your house if there's ever any problem with a gas supply. And yet they were basically fired and brought back on terms and conditions that were worse. Now, that's a bad thing to do anyway, and I would condemn it. But in the middle of a pandemic, I thought it was absolutely shocking. So it's one of the things the SNP has said they would do but haven't, was to set up a national energy company. So it's in our manifesto, and we're very ambitious, because we talked about climate change at the start. The next 5 years of the Scottish Parliament are the 5 years that can make the difference. So if you think about our climate targets, they are world beating. They are, to other countries, I've spoken to people who represent other parties in other countries, they are ahead of everybody. But our action has not been ahead of everybody. And that's one of the things I that made me come back to the Parliament in 2019, because I don't think we've done enough on climate change. So, for example, in terms of energy, although we've got huge expansion of renewables, which is great, we don't have a lot of community renewables. And the next generation of renewables, we need to see more community and cooperative owned renewables. And I want to see us using the model of having our councils setting up community heat networks that would be more affordable, but also accountable to people. So Scottish Labour has said we'd have a national energy company to lead on those issues. You need expertise, you need to be able to engage in the market. One of the things we'd like to do is to have more jobs in Scotland to provide for our renewables. So, for example, if you knew, we are suggesting that we should build 200,000 affordable homes over the next decade. Well, what you would do then is you'd have a pipeline of development, and companies would know that if you were talking about heat networks, solar panels, or if you're going to do heat pumps, they would know that there was a point in investing in Scotland. And we'd use the Scottish National Investment Bank alongside the energy company to make sure that you would invest in local jobs. And that would make it would create jobs locally, sometimes in areas where people desperately need work, apprenticeships for young people coming out of the pandemic, but also in our communities. We'd want to see a doubling of the retrofitting of our homes. So at the end of this decade, you would have people with warmer homes, they could afford to heat, and we'd start putting in renewables as well, but do it in such a way that people could afford it. So I think that's a really exciting part of our manifesto, and I think it's a potential game changer, because 25% of our emissions in Scotland are from our buildings and 75% of those emissions from our homes. So it's a total no-brainer. But you know, it's an example of our joined up thinking as a Labour Party. You tackle inequality, you create jobs and training opportunities, long-term jobs for people, but you'd also tackle climate change. And every pound the next Parliament spends is going to have to do more than just the one job. So we want to make sure that tackling inequality is going to be at the heart of all our public expenditure. So not only would we not have 0 hours contracts, we want people to be paid a decent salary. I was just looking at the stats before I came on to the show today, and a quarter of our children live in poverty, but 2/3 of those kids have one or both parents who are working. So we have got a real problem about the salaries people earn. And that takes me back to that very first point. During the pandemic, actions by British Gas were just appalling, because they were pushing us back in terms of negotiations between trade unions and companies. And I want to see our private companies being much more ethical as we go forward.
Before we get on to the manifesto, Sarah, which we're going to touch on a lot of the key issues, you were talking about inequality and a policy programme to tackle that. If we just take a wee step back and have a look at UK Labour, obviously Jeremy Corbyn put forward a very radical plan that had a lot of great policies in it. In the past week, or not just the past week, but the past few months anyway, or since Boris Johnson was elected as PM, we've saw a Tory party get away with so much. A bullying scandal in Downing Street. We've saw a private contracts from Matt Hancock as health secretary, and now we've saw this abhorrent comment come out, which of course the PM denies, but there's plenty of UK journalists saying that they've got good source that Boris Johnson said that. Has the media's treatment of the Tory government surprised you in any way, to the way that they treated Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, I know his son put out a tweet today saying, whatever you think of my old man, it's never in a comment he would say, and if anything, he would have stopped the bodies piling up.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is because we're in a pandemic, and I think, even in the Scottish Parliament, although we would give the SNP government a hard time when it's appropriate, in terms of things like vaccine rollout, which we wanted to be faster, we're not going in there every day just to bash the government. We're going in and trying to be constructive. And I think at the UK level, we've clearly led the way. And the talk about the Four Nations work on getting the vaccine rolled out and tackling the pandemic. There's clearly a balance to be struck there. But I think what you've seen in the last few weeks has just been absolutely appalling in terms of the question marks over Boris Johnson's private phone texting. We've got a system in Scotland whereby if a private company lobbies you, or in fact anybody who's earning a salary lobbies you because they want you to put legislation forward or influence the spending of the Parliament or ask a question, that has to be logged on the internet and anyone can see it. And it's one of the things that I think is a strength in terms of legislation that Neil Findlay himself was involved in getting the Parliament to adopt another Labour bill that went through. So lobbying legislation, I think, I go back to the point I made a few minutes ago. Our Parliament was set up looking at best practice around the world, and the UK Parliament is an old Parliament that slowly modernises. So those kind of issues, if it's a face-to-face conversation, so if somebody lobbies me on a Zoom call or they meet me, that has to be reported because somebody's lobbying me. And I think that's totally appropriate. So there's something about making sure that contract servants, if you're a government minister, you have to have at least one of your civil servants with you at all times when you've got an official meeting and your meeting is recorded. And that's really important in terms of accountability. So there's something for both the Scottish and the UK governments. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I watched Keir Starmer dissect Boris Johnson in Parliament last week when he was asking him about the James Dyson texts, and it is just unacceptable. These are big government contracts, and this was one of the contracts that we're talking about was people have got shares in those companies and they're arguing for the government to give huge contracts. And it's all done under the guise of, well, there's a pandemic, we don't have time to do business as usual. That cannot be acceptable. So I actually think the Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, but Angela Rayner has also been very effective in the last few days, calling them out. And, things have got to change, because that kind of, that's just not acceptable for government ministers. It doesn't matter who the party is, but, it's letting people down who through the pandemic have people in the health service have given their lives to keep the rest of us going. And you look at the impact on people from low incomes who live in overcrowded accommodation, people from Black and ethnic minorities, the women who've done the care jobs that are underpaid. Those people have kept us going over the last year. So what has been happening in this Tory government is an insult to all those people who have kept us going. We've obviously got our own issues in Scotland with the SNP's care homes scandal, where patients were sent home from hospital without being tested. So, but there's an accountability there, and we have argued for a public inquiry. I think there should also be a public inquiry now about what UK ministers have been doing in terms of awarding contracts.
Just going on to the manifesto, Anna Sawal's been talking about a national recovery plan and saying how other parties are talking about this, but it's all rhetoric, whereas Labour have got the substance and the policy to back it up. So what are the main ideas behind that national recovery plan? What is it built on?
Well, what we've said, and over the last few weeks of the campaign, we've had different launches that set out in detail what we would do that would be different, but also setting out it's like a story of how we think the next Parliament should work. We think all of the Parliament's energies in Scotland for the next 5 years should be a COVID recovery Parliament. And if you think about people who've lost their jobs to date, they need jobs. So we've got a jobs recovery programme. In fact, I'll mention the 5 recovery programmes and it will remind me to just mention them. The jobs recovery, a health recovery plan, education recovery, climate and communities. So for me, the jobs recovery plan is absolutely crucial, because young people in particular who've either left school or college or university, or who might have been in hospitality, not all those young people have been given support during the last year. So not everybody's had access to furlough payments. So there's a real urgent issue about young people getting them access into jobs. So we've been looking at, there's some really exciting ideas in there, using one of the ideas of the New Deal of the US after the Second World War, to have 10,000 jobs, a climate core that would be transforming our rural environment and greening our natural environment. So tree planting jobs, restoring our peatlands, So the Nature Conservation Corps, I think, is a really exciting idea. Nobody else has suggested anything at all similar. And some of the things we've talked about in jobs. So there's £11 billion of public sector money gets spent every year on contracts. So we've said none of those contracts should have people on short-term contracts that are precarious contracts, so 0 hours contracts. They should be proper terms and conditions so people can rely on it. So if you're paying, whether you're paying a rent or a mortgage, you can pay your bills. So that would also begin to start to tackle the poverty agenda we've got. But we've also said, see, with those jobs, in addition to having better terms and conditions, and that'd be good for the reputation of those companies, but good for the motivation and the output of their staff. We also want to see companies that get contracts have a climate plan, and that's about how they reduce their climate emissions, the use of materials that they would have, for example, where they are sourced from, and making sure that they are climate friendly as well. So there are two good examples of how we change things. I mentioned earlier the issue of retrofitting people's homes. So it's quite shocking, but it was one of the things I worked on in the last Parliament and pressed the SNP for more action. But our poverty levels in terms of fuel poverty, we've been going into reverse. And we've got something like a third of our older people have got fuel poverty, but a quarter of the population, and it's higher in the rural areas. So we'd retrofit people's homes, make them more energy efficient, and that would create something like 7,500 jobs. If we had the building programme that we talked about, affordable new housing over the next decade, that potentially creates 19,000 jobs. And both of those initiatives would be across the country. So that would mean that whether you lived in Edinburgh, whether you lived in Dalkeith or Midlothian, whether you're up in the Highlands, there'd be job opportunities. So I think the jobs agenda is really exciting, and it's linked into our climate plans, because things like, if at the moment, you know, only 12% of our buses in Scotland are green buses, and yet we've got a company in Falkirk that actually builds buses that are best in class in the world. And if we converted our bus fleets into green buses, you would create another 2,500 jobs. So, you know, it starts to add up, and I think it's 175,000 jobs on our jobs programme. And it's by far, it's not just more ambitious than the other parties, it is the most ambitious jobs programme since the Parliament was set up in '99. So I think that's very exciting. But, you know, creating jobs, tackling poverty, tackling our environmental challenges, joined up approach. The health service, for me, my top priority is getting a new eye pavilion in Edinburgh, because the SNP cancelled that. They stopped NHS Lothian progressing it. They said, you're not funding it now or in the foreseeable future. And we have worked really hard. I've got a petition. We've worked cross-party with other parties. And the NHS is going to need a huge investment, because you've not just got people who have missed out on operations, but there are people for cancer, for example, who's, by not being seen, their cancer's potentially got worse. So we're going to have to accelerate their treatments. And then all the people that have got long COVID, now older people are surviving because people are getting the 2 jabs, but there's a younger generation who have got COVID, and I've spoken to a couple of people, and the impact on their lives is just horrific. People that months after they've had COVID. So mental health support is going to be needed there as well. So the health service, our third plan is for young people, because our schools need investment. And we've said employing new teachers, 3,000 new teachers, but also looking at what's happened to those kids in the last year. Not all of them have got parents who've had access to the right IT kit. And that was ironically one of our plans in the 2019 election, Jeremy Corbyn's plan for better internet connections.
It was described as a communist, a communist policy, wasn't it? Because you wanted to give kids free Wi-Fi.
And now,
crazy.
And now we are talking about it, and you can see other parties in Scotland looking at how do kids get laptops or iPads, but crucially, how do their parents have access to the internet, whether it's a dongle or whether it's actually internet in their house. So there's a catch-up plan. So we want every young person at school to get an individual catch-up plan, because while some parents have been magnificent, if you were taught 20 years before your kid, you are not going to know the curriculum inside out. And especially those parents who are working from home or are working away from home. That's a really tough gig for a lot of parents for the last year. So a comeback plan, and also tackling the fact that in the richest and poorest areas, if you're from a well-off family, you potentially get 5 higher results when you leave school. If you're from a low-income background, you get 1. Now, if that holds that young person back for the foreseeable future, not necessarily the whole of their lives, but it stops them getting into college, stops them getting into university, and might stop them getting a decent job where they could learn and develop from and get confidence. So things like sports and music tuition, we want them to be high profile, right up the agenda, especially during the summer, to bring kids back and supported with mental health support. One of the things I get really angry about is under the SNP, investment in mental health for children at schools has meant that you've had kids waiting months or a year before they get mental health support. Now, I can't imagine what that's like, because at that age, 2 weeks is like a lifetime. But imagine you and your parents waiting a year to get mental health support. So we're going to need to accelerate that post-pandemic. And I've mentioned climate change. The last one is about communities. And our communities have, in some places, come together, but we've also got so many people who've been isolated in the last year that's supporting our councils to bring local community organisations back to life, supporting groups, for example, who've handed out free food for the last year. We've seen a massive increase in food bank use as people have lost their jobs. So for us in Scottish Labour, it's got to be about a comeback parliament. So jobs, education, health, climate change in communities. And these are radical policies, but they're also very practical. They're all doable. And we're impatient to be able to get into that parliament to actually make the change that we think our constituents all need.
On the policy of climate, Sarah, you spoke earlier about you've got a passion for it. You're glad you went back to Parliament, and it's something that you've always taken a great interest in. What would you say to Scottish voters who would think that the only party to tackle climate is the Green Party, because it's basically what they're founded on? But what would you say to Scottish voters, and that Scottish Labour can tackle climate as well as the Scottish Green Party or any other party that get climate at the forefront of their manifesto plans?
Well, I would say that the reason we've got radical plans and radical legislation is because Scottish Labour pushed for more radical bills than were introduced initially by the SNP. So in 2009, when we were in opposition, and 2019, both those climate bills are stronger because of amendments by Scottish Labour. And we were prepared to negotiate with other parties. We worked hard to make sure that other parties would support it. And the legislation we've got is strong because of us. I would also say that when Scottish Labour was in power, we started off the climate revolution in terms of renewables. I set the first targets. And I don't know if you've ever watched Yes Minister, when the civil servant comes in and goes, "Oh, that's quite radical, Minister." Well, I set our first targets, and I was told, "These are radical targets, Minister." And I said, "Yeah, but we need radical targets because Scotland has got some of the most important renewables opportunities in the whole of Europe. If you think of the seas around Scotland for wave and tidal power, onshore wind, we've had a lot of onshore wind. What we've not had is lots of solar farms. So I'm really pleased that North Ayrshire Labour Council is going to have a council-owned solar farm. I want to see more heat networks. So Scottish Labour is very ambitious, and we're prepared to work with other parties. We know that at the moment it doesn't look like we're going to win the election and come first. But if Scottish Labour was the chief opposition, we would absolutely push the SNP government further on green jobs, on buses, on our houses, on renewables. And one of the other things we haven't talked about is climate education in schools. That's something that's missing at the moment, and we need to do more on that. And a lot of people talk about climate change as it's for the young generation. And there's a level to which that's absolutely true. By 2045, people that are young now will be going into their jobs and they'll be having families. But I would say for people that are alive now, the climate change is happening. In West Lothian last year, we had floods that we've never seen in West Lothian before. And we actually had one of the roads in West Edinburgh, one of the main roads leading in Edinburgh, got flooded. Now that is shocking. There's a map that I saw as a young town planner, and it had sea level rise and rivers rising, the River Clyde and the River Forth. And it was published again 2 weeks ago. And it just made me think we are not moving fast enough on this. So to people that have thought about voting for the Green Party, Labour is absolutely committed to tackling climate change. We've demonstrated it in the last Parliament. But the other thing we need to do is, it's not enough just to talk about tackling climate change. We've got to have the green jobs. We've got to have the pipelines of investment. The universities, places like Edinburgh and Heriot-Watt universities, they've got some groundbreaking research coming out of there, needs to be put into practice, needs to be implemented, and you need the whole government committed. So that's why our policies and procurement are important, like green buses, having more community-owned buses. People who live in the Lothians get access to Lothian buses. It's owned by our councils, and it is leading the way. It regularly wins awards for the best bus company in Britain. You go around the rest of Scotland, people don't have anything like as good bus services. They're more expensive. There aren't as many of them. And in the last year, we've seen the last few years, bus use has gone down by 16%. Now, we can't afford that when we're in a climate emergency. So the heavy lifting on transport, our homes, all of that's got to come. And Scottish Labour has got radical policies in our manifesto to deliver on that.
Talking about those radical policies, you're talking about creating loads of jobs. Only 12% of buses are green buses, so you want to get that up to obviously 100%. Sort of transforming transport in general, making it more green. There was talks of sort of a 4-day working week and universal basic income in the first leader debate. In the Labour manifesto, there's a promise to not raise any income tax rates. How do the party plan to sort of implement all these policies, spend all this money without raising any more revenue? And obviously during the pandemic, working class people have suffered. They've maybe lost their jobs, or British Gas have cut their wages. But when it comes to sort of people on a higher wage, the top 5 or 10% of earners, could they afford to pay more?
Yeah, well, we already have, if you're a higher income earner in Scotland, you do pay slightly more than the rest of the UK, and we supported more flexibility on taxes for that. But what we said at the moment is that certainly for the first couple of years of the Scottish Parliament, in the next term, we think the priority should be making better use of the existing funds that we've got. And there is the money there, especially if we look at the money that's come through from the UK government in terms of the consequentials the Scottish Parliament's entitled to. I think we've got, I can't remember the exact figure, but it is huge amounts of money has been spent, and public debt will have been built up during the last year. And we're absolutely confident our plans are capably implemented. And 1 or 2 of the policies we've looked at, so for example, giving people a voucher to go and spend 75 quid in the high street, we've costed that. Other countries have experimented with those kind of policies, and it has brought people back, not for, just to clarify, not for food shops, because they've all been open the last year, but to help other shops recover. I don't know if you heard the news this morning, Radio Scotland talking about no jobs, retail jobs. We've had, I think it's a 10-year change in 1 year, the scale of change in retail, the number of people that have lost jobs. So we want to regenerate our town centres. So that would be an example of, there's a bit of cash to get people back in shopping who've lost out. But it's also about remaking our town centres. So bringing new companies back into our town centres, bringing shops back to life, the buildings above shops, create new housing opportunities. That's good for the environment because you're reusing existing buildings. It would give opportunities for young people, for people who want to live in our towns. Means they don't have to own a car necessarily if they're able to work in the town as well. So we need to recraft how we do things. And there's been a lot of talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods. It's a trendy buzzword. So the idea is you could get a bus, you could walk, cycle. You don't always have to have a car. And if you look at Edinburgh and the Lothians, the last few years, because of house prices in Edinburgh, and because we've lost 14,000 houses to short-term lets, we can see huge expansion of places Mid Lothian, West Lothian, and that means people have to then commute back into the city for their jobs. But it also means the councils are having to pay for new schools and new transport infrastructure, and they haven't got that money. So our plans are practical, and they're building on understanding what the SNP have failed to deliver over the last 14 years, but also thinking about every pound you spend has got to deliver multiple benefits. So I'm very keen that the plans that Scottish Labour has are looked at by the electorate, because they'll see that they're practical and they'll see that they can transform their lives. So investment in town centres, we've talked about transport and housing. These are practical. So we're not talking about inventing stuff here. We're talking about practical things where if you put in a pipeline of investment, you would create jobs locally, you generate more income tax, you generate more support that comes in through non-domestic rates, and companies pay more tax. So actually very fast you begin to see the economy begins to pick up again. So it's partly about making sure that we've got a lot of small companies in Scotland who've really struggled over the last year. So to make sure that they don't go under. You know, I've spoken to women that run sports and keep fit classes over the last year, and to have to go all online because you can't have people in your building anymore in the city centre of Edinburgh, where you used to have a reasonable business, not massive profits, but it paid the bills. And those kind of companies are incredibly vulnerable at the moment. So anything we can do to support them stay active and keep people in employment and then grow in the future, that's got to be a priority for us. And finally, the last thing I'd mention is we want to see more on land reform. You know that Scotland has got one of the most private ownership of land by the smallest number of people. And that's after 2 land reform bills. The first one started by Labour, and in the last Parliament, Community Empowerment Act. So there's really big unfinished business there. And if you start doing more of that kind of work, potentially you could have more community renewables, wind turbines, solar companies. You begin to actually create jobs in the private sector, but you pull some of the profits back to local communities, you get them reinvested. That would be transformational. And as I say, although the technology is improving, we're not inventing this stuff out of thin air. This works in other countries, and we know it works in Scotland, but we just need to accelerate the rollout of it.
So just one of the final things I wanted to ask you about was 2011, along with Jim Murphy, the two of you both, after Ed Miliband commissioned a review in Scottish Labour. Just to ask you, obviously after that, the party went to third place at Holyrood, again picked back up again in 2017 with a bit more seats, and then lost those seats consequentially 2 years later. Where does the party go if they don't win opposition again? Do you think that there could be another possible review of the party? Because as political students, it's very interesting to see the party that was once so powerful in Scotland, party of government, party that majority of Scotland voted for, just kind of slip back so drastically and so quickly. Jerry Hassan's written a lot about the different factors and why he thinks that's been. Maybe the party's been too centralised with London and whatnot. Where do you think the party goes if it doesn't be successful in this election? And do you think another possible one of those reviews could benefit the party in the long term?
Well, the election is not over yet. So I am not going to talk us down in the run-up to an election where the polls have started moving in our direction for the first time in a long time. When I came back to the Scottish Parliament, I agreed to come back just before the Euro elections, where Labour came 5th in Scotland. Now we're beginning to come back from that result, and the most recent polls put us just overtaking the Conservatives into 2nd place. And I think that's partly testament to the leadership of Anas Sarwar. He's come in with energy, he's engaging with the public, he's communicating with people. He's also motivating us as party members to go out and campaign, because we are getting a good response from the voters, and the voters are looking at us again in the way they haven't done for a long time. And I can also detect SNP voters who are not keen on a referendum anytime soon. So that's not something I expected going out on the doorsteps. I've also met SNP voters who feel let down by the SNP. So you made a point about Scottish Labour lost power over a short period. When you look at the numbers, actually, it was a long-term issue. And that was our failing, was not actually regenerating earlier and not accepting that was happening. So The 97 elections, there was a drop in turnout. 99 elections when I was first elected. And I think at that point we should have had a better political strategy. And if I had my time again, which you don't get in life, I would have focused not just on all the things I did, but more on a political strategy as well, because we transformed opportunities for young people in further in higher education. We've seen a step back there from the SNP. The childcare we introduced, the massive train investment I've talked about earlier, free bus travel for older people. You now hear the SNP talking about the fact that they introduced free bus travel for the older people. No, they didn't. But that's something about if you're in power, you can claim stuff. And actually, I think we only marginally lost the elections in the third Scottish Parliament elections. So I see it as a slower but longer loss of votes and loss of confidence. And I find it fascinating looking at the SNP now, because their voters are less enthusiastic than they ever were. You've got Alex Salmond throwing the cat amongst the pigeons. So it's really interesting. This election is going to be fascinating, and I am confident that Scottish Labour is on the way back. And it's partly because we've got an excellent manifesto, we've got policies that relate to people, and they're coming across well. So we launched our manifesto last week, but actually we'd had 5 or 6 launches of our key manifesto commitments on jobs, on rebuilding our NHS, on giving kids an opportunity at school again, and childcare that would help their parents get to work, our radical climate policies, and investing in our communities. And actually, so over the last month, I think those messages have started to get across. And I am the last person to be complacent, because, as you've observed, I've been involved in looking at how we could improve in the past. But I actually think we're going to be in a different place after the elections. And I think having a NAS, he's not had much time to turn us around, but I think he's already making a difference. And in talking to people who are trade union activists, other candidates that were all out campaigning, and talking to voters, it's been great being able to get out and talk to voters on the streets or phoning them. And there's definitely a change in mood, and I think there's beginning to be a change of vote. So let's look at what happens in the elections. But I think there's a good chance that we might come second this time, and that would be a game changer. Because if Scottish Labour is the chief opposition, that is a much more difficult opposition for the SNP to deal with. They like having the Tories number 2, because we talked about Boris Johnson earlier. On one level he's an embarrassment, on another level he's the Prime Minister, and he won an election. So I would never ever be complacent. But I think we're getting our act together. We've learned a lot of the lessons of the past. And I think we've got a leader and a manifesto and a set of candidates that are passionate and are working hard and are, I think, beginning to reconnect with the voters. So let's see how the elections turn out. I studied politics at university as well. And Antonio Gramsci, optimism of the will, pessimism of spirit. And that's quite a good balance, because it tells you, don't get carried away. You always have to work hard and focus on what matters to people, but also be optimistic, give them hope for the future, tell them how you can transform their lives. And that is our agenda at this election. We've come through a horrendous pandemic that history books will talk about as a game changer for the world, I believe. And it will change our lives for the future. But we have got to get people jobs, get them decent housing that they can afford to heat, they can afford to pay the rent or the mortgage. And that kids, when they leave school, it's not with their postcode that determines their future. It's their own talent and the opportunities they've been able to develop at school. And that's, for me, establishing the Scottish Parliament was about those kind of values of fairness. And now with our climate emergency, I've always been an environmentalist. Before I got elected, I'd done 10 years being an environmental activist, but this Parliament is the one that changes the game for us or not in Scotland. And we've already got floods in Scotland, we've got sea level rise, and we've got to change how we're doing things, and that is totally possible. So that's why I'm hopeful at this election, and I'd be delighted to come back and talk to you afterwards to see whether my optimism is granted. But I think the polls are moving in the right direction, and the mood music, the number of people that mention and ask Sarwar when you go at the doorstep as a good thing, that they like him and they found it really interesting listening to our policies. I am hopeful for the elections this time round.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for coming on, and good luck in the election. Where can people find you on social media?
I am at Sarah BOYACK, and if you Google me on Facebook, you'll find my Sarah BOYACK, my main Facebook, where I've got all my pals, and then you've got my campaign Sarah BOYACK for Lothian List profile. And if you go onto Instagram, you will find me on there as well. So I am on social media, and happy to engage with people as well. Or just drop me an email, sboyack, which is SBOYACK @gmail.com.
Okay, well, as Patrick said, we wish you all the very best for the 6th of May, and it would be delighted to have you back on. So we'll look forward to that. And once again, we thank you for taking the time out your busy schedule in the run up to an election to chat to us in the state of politics, Sarah.
It's been great. Thank you very much.